There is a rumor that refuses to die. It floats around the darkest corners of the internet, from Reddit threads to conspiracy forums. The story goes like this. In 1958, NASA was founded. But contrary to popular belief, their original mission wasn't just to explore the stars above, it was to map the oceans below. They built submarines, they trained divers, and they began to descend into the abyss. But then, on a specific day in 1978, everything stopped. Without warning, NASA pulled every single asset out of the water. They abandoned their oceanographic research entirely and shifted 100% of their focus toward space. The rumor claims they didn't leave because of budget cuts. They didn't leave because of politics. They left because they found something. Something down there in the darkness scared them. Something so terrifying that the US government decided that the vacuum of space was safer than the depths of our own planet. It sounds like science fiction. It sounds like a movie script. But here is the part that will keep you awake at night. While the monster part might be a myth, the timeline is actually real. NASA did explore the ocean, and then they did stop. Why? What is down there that is so difficult or so dangerous that the world's greatest explorers chose to flee the planet rather than face it? Today, we are going to separate the myth from the math. We are going to dive into the crushing reality of the deep and uncover the real reason NASA looked up and why they might finally be forced to look back down. To understand the fear, we first have to understand the history. Most people think of NASA solely as the space agency, but that is a modern oversimplification. In the mid-20th century, the line between astronaut and aquanaut was incredibly thin. In the 1960s, humanity was obsessed with frontiers. We had the sky and we had the sea, and surprisingly, NASA was heavily involved in both. This is where the conspiracy theories get their grain of truth. NASA actually ran a program called Tektite. In 1969, while Neil Armstrong was preparing to walk on the moon, NASA scientists were living at the bottom of the ocean. The Tektite habitat was an underwater laboratory located in the Virgin Islands. Groups of scientists, including astronauts, would descend 50 feet underwater and live there for weeks at a time. The goal was psychological and physiological. NASA needed to know how humans behaved in isolation. They needed to know how we handle confinement in hostile environments. And the ocean floor was a perfect simulation for a space station. It wasn't just Tektite. NASA launched CSAT in 1978. This was the first satellite designed specifically to monitor Earth's oceans with synthetic aperture radar. It was a technological marvel. It could see waves, measure wind speeds, and map the ocean surface with unprecedented accuracy. But then the glitch happened. After only 106 days in orbit, CSAT suffered a massive catastrophic failure. The official report said it was a short circuit in the electrical system. The satellite died, the data stream cut off. And this is where the internet detectives lose their minds. A $100 million satellite designed to look at the ocean dies after 3 months? Conspiracy theorists argue that CSAT saw too much. Did it map a submerged city? Did it detect a massive biological signature in the deep Pacific? Or did it track a vehicle moving at speeds that defy physics? The timing is suspicious to some. Tech Day ended, CSAT died, and NASA's public messaging shifted aggressively towards the space shuttle program and deep space probes like Voyager. To the casual observer, it looked like a retreat. It looked like humanity dipped its toe in the dark water, felt something brush against its leg, and ran screaming for the safety of the stars. But the reality is far more complex, and honestly far more interesting than a sea monster. The reason NASA hates the ocean isn't biological, it's physical. Let's talk about pressure. We tend to think of space as the ultimate hostile environment. It's a vacuum, it's freezing, it's bathed in radiation. But in terms of pure engineering, space is actually easy. When you build a spaceship, you are building a container designed to hold 1 atmosphere of pressure inside against 0 atmospheres outside. The pressure differential is only 1 unit. It's like an inflated balloon. It wants to expand, sure, but the structural stress is manageable. We have had the technology to handle that since the 1940s. The ocean is the exact opposite, and it is infinitely more violent. For every 10 meters you go down, the pressure increases by 1 atmosphere. By the time you reach the bottom of the Mariana Trench, the deepest point on Earth, you are dealing with over 1,000 atmospheres of pressure. Imagine an elephant. Now imagine that elephant balancing on a single postage stamp. Now imagine that postage stamp is your skull. That is the water pressure at the bottom of the ocean. If a spaceship springs a leak, air rushes out. You have time to patch it. You might survive. If a deep-sea submersible cracks, it doesn't leak, it implodes. It happens in a fraction of a millisecond. The air inside the sub is compressed so instantly that it heats up to the temperature of the surface of the sun. The vessel and everyone inside it is vaporized before their brains can even process the signal of pain. This is why we have mapped 100% of the surface of Mars, a planet 140 million miles away, but we have only mapped about 20% of our own ocean floor to a high resolution. Radio waves travel through the vacuum of space at the speed of light. You can control a rover on Mars from a desk in California. But water kills radio waves. Water is opaque to almost all our convenient communication methods. To map the ocean, you can't just fly a satellite over it. You have to use sonar. You have to physically go there with a ship, moving slowly, blasting sound waves at the bottom for decades. So, did NASA stop exploring the ocean because they were scared of a monster? No, they stopped prioritizing it because space is transparent and the ocean is a wall of noise and crushing death. Space is empty, the ocean is heavy, and NASA is an agency of engineers. They chose the path where their rockets wouldn't be crushed like soda cans. But that's not the whole story, because recently, NASA has started looking at the ocean again. But not the one you think. Here is the twist. The conspiracy theorists are right about one thing. NASA is searching for something in the water. They just realized they were looking in the wrong ocean. For decades, we assumed that for life to exist, it needed sunlight. We thought the Goldilocks zone meant a planet had to be at the perfect distance from a star to have liquid water on its surface. Earth is the anomaly. Earth is the garden. But in the late 70s, right around the time NASA allegedly gave up on the ocean, marine biologists made a shocking discovery right here on Earth. They found hydrothermal vents deep in the abyss where sunlight never touches, where the pressure is lethal and the water is boiling hot. They found life. Not just bacteria, but complex ecosystems. Giant tube worms, blind crabs, terrifying fish. These creatures didn't need the sun. They survived on chemosynthesis, eating the chemicals spewing from the Earth's core. This changed everything. It meant that life didn't need a nice planet. It just needed water and energy. Suddenly, NASA looked at the solar system with new eyes. They looked at the frozen, dead moons of Jupiter and Saturn, moons that they had previously ignored. Take Europa, one of Jupiter's moons. On the surface, it's a frozen wasteland blasted by radiation. It looks like a dead ball of ice. But data from the Voyager and Galileo probes suggested something incredible. The ice on Europa is cracking. It's shifting. Why? Because underneath that miles-thick shell of ice, there is a warm, salty, liquid ocean. And it's not just a puddle. Europa has 2 to 3 times more water than all of Earth's oceans combined. Then there is Enceladus, the tiny moon of Saturn. In 2005, the Cassini spacecraft saw something that shouldn't be possible. Geysers, massive plumes of water vapor shooting hundreds of miles into space from the moon's south pole. NASA flew Cassini through those plumes and tasted the water. Do you know what they found? Organic molecules, salts, energy sources. Enceladus isn't just the moon. It is a planetary ocean, encased in a shell of ice, spewing the ingredients for life into the void. So the conspiracy that NASA stopped exploring the ocean is false. They simply realized that the Atlantic and Pacific are just 2 oceans in a solar system full of them. And the oceans on Europa and Enceladus are far more likely to answer the ultimate question: are we alone? But this brings us back to the fear. If these alien oceans are so promising, why haven't we found anything yet? And if we do find something, should we be celebrating or should we be terrified? There is a concept in astrobiology called the Great Filter. It suggests that somewhere along the path from dead matter to spacefaring civilization, there is a wall, a hurdle so difficult that almost no one makes it past. If NASA sends a probe to Europa, like the Europa Clipper mission, launching soon, and finds microbes, bacteria, or alien fish swimming in the dark, that would be the biggest scientific discovery in human history. But it would also be a warning. If life is easy to start, if it can start in the dark, high-pressure oceans of a frozen moon, then the universe should be teeming with life. There should be civilizations everywhere. But as we know, the sky is silent. If we find life on Europa, it means the Great Filter isn't behind us. It means the hard part isn't starting life. The hard part is surviving. It means a filter lies ahead of us. Maybe civilizations don't leave their oceans. Think about it. If an intelligent species evolved in the subsurface ocean of Enceladus, they would have a roof of ice miles thick. They wouldn't see the stars. They wouldn't know the universe exists. They would live and die in their closed, dark world, thinking their ocean was the entire cosmos. Maybe that is the trap. Maybe the universe is full of life, but it's all trapped under ice, hiding in the dark, unable to break through the surface. NASA didn't stop exploring the ocean because they saw a monster. They stopped because they realized that to find the truth, they had to build a new kind of submarine, a submarine that flies through space. We are currently building robots designed to melt through the ice of Europa. We are designing drones to swim in the methane seas of Titan. The era of ocean exploration hasn't ended. It has just gone interplanetary. The depths of our own oceans are scary, yes, but the depths of an alien ocean, that is where the real monsters or the real miracles are waiting. If we find something staring back at us from the ice of Europa, it will change everything. It will prove that we are not special. It will prove that life is stubborn, and it will force us to ask, if they are down there, why haven't they come up here? Perhaps some things are better left in the dark. What do you think? Should we act as a beacon, or should we stay silent in the void? If you enjoyed this deep dive into the unknown, make sure to hit the subscribe button. We explore the darkest corners of the universe every week, and you don't want to be left behind. Thanks for watching, and keep looking up, but don't forget to look down.